The whisper reached Alina Whitcomb before she even stepped through the tall doors of Camden Hall. She heard her own name pass from one painted mouth to another, soft and sharp like a blade wrapped in silk. There she is, the one Lord Hale left standing at the altar. Alina kept her chin level and her steps even, though her heart beat so hard she feared the pearls at her throat might shake with it. She had promised her mother she would not run from this ball. She had promised herself the same thing 3 years ago, and she had broken that promise more times than she could count. The ballroom of Camden Hall glowed with 100 candles, and the light caught on jewels, on silk, on the hard, curious eyes of everyone who turned to watch her enter. Alina felt the room take a slow breath, the way a crowd does when it senses something is about to happen. She told herself it was only her imagination. She told herself that people had better things to think about than a woman who had been left waiting in a church 3 years past. But the truth sat heavy in her chest. In this world, a broken engagement did not fade. It followed a woman like a shadow, growing longer with every year she remained unmarried. She was 28 years old now. Old enough, the matrons said behind their fans, that hope had surely run out for her. Old enough that even her own mother had stopped mentioning suitors at breakfast, as though the subject itself might cause pain. Alina had grown used to the quiet, cutting comments. She had grown used to the pity in some eyes and the amusement in others. What she had not grown used to, what she suspected she never would grow used to, was walking into a room and feeling every eye measure her and find her wanting. Her mother, Margaret Whitcomb, walked a step behind her, gripping her fan so tightly that her knuckles had gone pale. "Chin up, my dear," her mother murmured, not moving her lips. "We are here because we were invited, and we shall behave as though we belong because we do." Alina wanted to believe her. She wanted more than anything to believe that she still belonged in rooms like this one, filled with lace and laughter, and the particular cruelty of people who had never once been made to feel small. But belief was a difficult thing to hold on to when Lady Priscilla Vance stood not 20 feet away. Her golden curls arranged just so, her smile already curling at the corners as she caught sight of Alina across the room. Priscilla had been the one to spread the story fastest 3 years ago. She had not been unkind exactly, not in the way anyone could point to and call cruel outright. She had simply repeated what happened over and over to anyone who would listen, until the story wore a groove into the minds of the whole county. Poor Alina Whitcomb, left at the altar. One does wonder what she did to drive him away. It was never said with malice in front of witnesses. It was always said with a small, sad shake of the head, the kind that invited others to wonder rather than to know. Alina moved further into the room, and the crowd parted for her the way a crowd parts for someone it does not wish to touch. She found a spot near one of the tall windows, half hidden by a great arrangement of white roses, and there she stood, watching the dancers turn beneath the candlelight, feeling the old, familiar ache settle into her chest. She had not always been the woman standing in the shadows. Once, she had been the one at the center of every dance, laughing without fear, certain that her life would unfold exactly as she had planned it. Edmund Hale had asked for her hand beneath the oak trees at her family's estate, and she had said yes before he had even finished the question. She remembered the way the whole church had smelled of lilies on the morning of the wedding, how her hands had trembled with joy rather than fear as her maid fastened the final buttons on her gown. She did not like to remember what came after, the messenger arriving at the church door instead of the groom, the murmurs rising through the pews like smoke, her father's face, gray and stricken, as he came to tell her that Edmund Hale had left the county that very morning, bound for London, with no explanation offered to anyone. She had stood in her wedding gown for nearly an hour before her mother had finally coaxed her out of the church, past the crowd of guests who did not know where to look. 3 years had passed since that morning, and Alina had rebuilt herself slowly, carefully, the way one rebuilds a house after a fire, uncertain if the new walls will ever feel as solid as the old ones did. She had learned to smile at gatherings even when her chest ached. She had learned to answer polite questions about her health and her family without her voice betraying her. But she had never quite learned how to walk into a ballroom without feeling as though every person in it were silently counting the years since her disgrace. A young woman she barely recognized swept past her, arm in arm with a laughing gentleman, and Alina caught the tail end of a sentence not meant for her ears. Do you suppose she came hoping the Duke might notice her? At her age. The words landed like a slap, though they were spoken lightly, almost fondly, as though mocking her were simply a pleasant way to pass an evening. Alina's cheeks burned, but she did not turn to face the speaker. She had learned that lesson long ago as well. To turn, to argue, to defend herself in any way only fed the story further. The only defense that worked, the only one that had ever worked, was silence and a straight back. She thought briefly and without real hope of the Duke of Camden, whose grand house this was, whose name was on every invitation in the county this season. She had never spoken to him. Few women had, beyond the necessary courtesies of a ballroom. He was known to be reserved, almost cold, a man who attended every important gathering and yet seemed to belong to none of them. There were rumors, of course, that his aunt, the Dowager Duchess, was pressing him toward marriage, that his estate required an heir, that half the eligible women in the county had already fixed their sights on him. Alina had never once imagined herself among that number. A duke did not look twice at a woman whose own betrothed had abandoned her in front of the whole parish. She watched him now from her place near the window. He stood near the far end of the room, tall and still amid the swirl of dancers, dressed in dark blue that made the gold trim at his shoulders catch the candlelight. He was speaking to an older gentleman, his expression polite but distant, the way a man looks when his mind is elsewhere entirely. Alina had heard he rarely danced. She had heard he found most conversation tedious. She had heard 100 things about the Duke of Camden, and she suspected most of them were only half true, the way most things people said about anyone were only half true. A movement near her elbow made her turn, and her stomach dropped as she recognized Priscilla Vance approaching, her skirts swishing with practiced grace, 2 other young women trailing behind her like ducklings behind a proud mother bird. Alina, dear, Priscilla said, her voice carrying just enough for the nearest guests to hear. How brave of you to come tonight. I confess, I did wonder whether you would. Alina kept her voice steady, though it cost her something to do it. Why would I not come, Priscilla? I was invited the same as anyone. Of course, Priscilla said, exchanging a glance with the young woman beside her that needed no words to explain its meaning. It is only that balls can be so difficult, can they not, when one has such unhappy memories attached to them. I only meant it kindly. The 2 young women beside Priscilla pressed their lips together, clearly fighting laughter, and Alina felt the old, familiar heat rise in her throat, the urge to defend herself warring with the certainty that any defense would only give them more to repeat tomorrow over their morning tea. I find balls quite pleasant, actually, Alina said, forcing evenness into her voice. Perhaps it depends upon the company one keeps. It was a small thing to say, barely a retort at all, but Priscilla's smile thinned for just a moment before it returned, brighter and harder than before. How lovely that you still have your spirit, she said. Some women, in your position, might have simply retired from society altogether. I do admire your courage in continuing to try. She said try in a way that made the word sound like a diagnosis, a small cruelty dressed up as compliment, and Alina felt the eyes of nearby guests drifting toward her, some curious, some pitying, a few openly amused. She thought of turning and walking away, out through the tall doors and into the cool night air, away from all of it. But her mother stood not far off, watching with a tight, worried face, and Alina knew that if she fled now, the story would only grow larger by morning. So she stayed. She lifted her chin, the way her mother had taught her, and she said nothing further, letting Priscilla's little group drift away toward the refreshment table, their heads bent together in quiet, delighted conversation. Alina turned back toward the window, pressing her gloved hands together to still their trembling, and told herself, as she had told herself so many times before, that the night would end eventually, that she only had to endure it, the way she had endured every gathering for 3 long years. She did not yet know that before the night was over, every eye in that ballroom would be fixed on her again, not with pity this time, but with a shock so complete that the orchestra itself would falter mid-note. She did not yet know that the man in dark blue standing across the room, the one she had never dared to imagine noticing her at all, had already noticed far more about her than she could guess. She only knew, standing there among the white roses with her heart still aching from Priscilla's practiced cruelty, that she wished, more than anything, that this single night might somehow be different from all the ones that came before it. She could not have known how right she was. Across the ballroom, Nathaniel Ashford, Duke of Camden, had already noticed her. He had noticed her the moment she walked through the doors, though he gave no outward sign of it, keeping his face arranged in the same polite, distant expression he wore at every gathering his position required him to attend. It was a useful mask, that expression. It allowed him to stand in the middle of a crowded room and think of nothing that anyone around him could guess at, while appearing to listen with perfect attention to whatever tedious remark was being offered to him at the moment. Tonight the remark belonged to Lord Barrow, a portly gentleman who had cornered him near the punch table to discuss, at great length, the merits of a new breed of hunting hound he intended to purchase. Nathaniel nodded at what he judged to be the correct intervals, murmured agreement when it seemed required, and let his gaze drift, again and again, toward the window where Alina Whitcomb stood half-hidden among the white roses. He knew her name, of course. Everyone in the county knew her name, though most of them knew it only as a story, a cautionary tale murmured over tea. The woman left at the altar. Nathaniel found he disliked that phrase intensely, though he had never said so aloud to anyone. It reduced a whole person, with a whole life and a whole heart, down to a single terrible mourning that had not even been her doing. He remembered the first time he had truly spoken with her, though she likely did not remember it at all, or perhaps remembered it only as a small, forgettable kindness among a childhood full of larger, more important things. He had been 19, newly returned from his studies, awkward in rooms full of people who expected him to already carry himself like a duke though his father had not yet passed. There had been a garden party, one of 100 such parties that summer, and he had said something clumsy and unintentionally cutting to a young woman who had laughed too loudly at his joke. He could not now recall exactly what he had said, only that it had been thoughtless, and that the young woman's face had crumpled with hurt before she hurried away. It had been Alina, then only 17 and already known for her quick, generous nature, who had come to find him afterward, not to scold him but to explain, gently and without any trace of judgment, why his words had wounded the girl so deeply. She had not embarrassed him in front of others. She had drawn him aside, spoken to him quietly, and helped him understand something about himself that no one else had bothered to point out. He had thanked her awkwardly, and she had smiled and told him that everyone said thoughtless things sometimes, and that what mattered was learning from them. He had never forgotten it. In a world where most people spoke to him only to flatter him or to extract some advantage from his position, her small, honest kindness had stayed with him in a way he had never quite been able to explain, even to himself. Over the years he had watched her from a distance, at balls and garden parties and church services, never speaking to her again with any real depth, but noticing her all the same. He had noticed her joy when she became engaged to Edmund Hale. He had noticed, with a discomfort he did not examine too closely, that something in his own chest had tightened at the sight of her happiness belonging to another man. And he had noticed, 3 years ago, exactly what had happened on the morning of her wedding, because Edmund Hale had been, unfortunately, a distant acquaintance of his own, a man Nathaniel had never much cared for but had been forced by circumstance to know. He knew things about that morning that Alina herself did not know, things he had never spoken of to anyone, because to speak of them would have required explaining how he came to know them at all, and that was a door he had not yet decided whether to open. Lord Barrow was still speaking about the hunting hound. Nathaniel offered another small nod, and allowed his gaze to return once more to the window. He had watched Priscilla Vance approach her only minutes ago, and he had watched the whole small, cruel exchange unfold from across the room, close enough to see the way Alina's shoulders had tightened, though not close enough to hear the exact words exchanged. He did not need to hear them. He had watched this same performance play out at gathering after gathering for 3 years. Priscilla and her circle circling Alina like well-dressed wolves, delivering their cruelty with smiles so polished that anyone watching from a distance might mistake it for friendliness. It angered him more than he cared to admit, even to himself. He was not a man given to strong outward displays of feeling. His late father had taught him, from a very young age, that a duke's temper was a dangerous thing, capable of ruining reputations and careers with a single sharp word spoken in the wrong company. Nathaniel had learned that lesson well, perhaps too well. He had grown so skilled at containing his feelings that he sometimes wondered if anyone in the county believed he possessed any feelings at all. His aunt, the Dowager Duchess Constance, certainly seemed to believe otherwise, though she rarely said so directly. She had cornered him in his study only that morning before the ball, to remind him for what felt like the 100th time that the estate required an heir, that he was nearly 30 years old, that every eligible young woman in the county had been paraded before him at one gathering or another with no result whatsoever. "You cannot simply stand at the edges of every ballroom forever, Nathaniel," she had said, tapping her cane against the floor for emphasis. "Choose someone. Choose anyone. The name matters less than you think, so long as she is sensible and kind." He had not answered her directly. He rarely did when the subject turned to marriage. It was not that he objected to the idea itself. He understood as well as anyone that a duke's duty included securing his line, and he was not a man who shirked his duties. What he objected to, what he had always objected to, was the notion that he ought to choose a wife the way one chose a horse at auction, weighing bloodlines and dowries and social standing above every other consideration. He had watched too many marriages in his own circle built on exactly that arithmetic, and he had watched too many of those marriages curdle slowly into polite, distant coldness within a handful of years. He wanted something else, though he had never said so plainly to his aunt or to anyone. He wanted, if he was honest with himself in the quiet of his own mind, something like what he had glimpsed once, briefly, in a 17-year-old girl who had taken the time to correct a foolish young man's manners without humiliating him, simply because she believed he deserved the chance to do better. Lord Barrow finally exhausted the subject of hunting hounds and moved on to some new topic Nathaniel did not bother to follow closely. Across the room, Priscilla Vance and her companions had drifted away from Alina, leaving her alone once more near the window, her back straight, her chin lifted, though even from this distance Nathaniel could see the tightness in her shoulders that told him the exchange had cost her more than she would ever admit. He watched her smooth her gloves, a small, unconscious gesture he suspected she was not even aware of making. He watched her glance toward the dance floor with an expression that was not quite longing and not quite resignation, but something caught uncomfortably between the two. He thought of all the years he had watched her from a distance, always at the edge of some room, never once approaching her, telling himself there would be time later, that it would not be proper, that a duke did not simply walk across a ballroom and speak to a woman without some occasion to justify it. He was tired, he realized, standing there with Lord Barrow's voice fading into a meaningless hum beside him, of waiting for an occasion that never seemed to arrive. Something shifted in him then, some old, careful caution finally beginning to crack. He had spent so many years guarding his own feelings so carefully that he had nearly convinced himself he had none left to guard. But watching Alina Whitcomb stand alone by that window, enduring, yet again, the quiet cruelty of people who had never once had to earn their own place in the world, something in his chest refused to remain still any longer. He excused himself from Lord Barrow with a brief, practiced courtesy, and began to make his way across the ballroom, unaware, or perhaps simply uncaring, that half the room had already begun to notice the Duke of Camden moving with clear purpose for the first time that anyone could recall. Whispers rose in his wake, curious and quickening, though he paid them no mind at all. His eyes were fixed on the window, on the woman standing alone beneath it, and on the growing certainty settling into him with each step, that he did not intend to let this evening end the way every other evening had ended for her. He did not yet know exactly what he meant to do when he reached her. He only knew that he could not stand at the edge of the room a moment longer, watching her carry the weight of other people's cruelty alone. When he had spent years wishing, he possessed the courage to cross exactly this distance between them. The orchestra began a new piece, something slow and sweeping, and still he walked, closer now, close enough to see the surprise flickering across Eleanor's face as she noticed him approaching, close enough to see her glance behind herself, clearly certain he must be walking toward someone else entirely. He was not. For the first time in longer than he could remember, Nathaniel Ashford, Duke of Camden, was walking toward exactly what he wanted. And nothing in the room, not propriety, not gossip, not even his own long habit of careful restraint, was going to stop him. Eleanor did not notice him at first. She was too busy trying to steady her own breathing, too busy telling herself that Priscilla's words meant nothing, that she had survived worse insults delivered with sharper smiles, that in an hour or two this evening would simply become another memory to fold away and forget. She kept her eyes fixed on the dance floor, on the swirl of silk and candlelight, and tried to lose herself in the simple beauty of it, the way she used to lose herself in dances before her whole world had narrowed down to a single ruined morning. She did not see Priscilla, and her companions turning back toward her until it was too late to slip away unnoticed. "Oh, Eleanor," Priscilla called out, her voice pitched just loud enough to draw the attention of the guests nearby. "We simply must ask you something." Beatrice here was wondering whether it is true that Lord Hale sent word to your family only that very morning, and not the night before as everyone assumed. Do forgive us for asking so plainly, but the details of it have always seemed so terribly mysterious. The words landed in the air like a struck bell, and Eleanor felt the nearby conversations falter, felt heads turning, felt the particular hush that settles over a room when it senses a story about to be told again, even when it has heard 100 times before. Her stomach twisted painfully. She had never spoken of the details of that morning to anyone outside her own family, not even to her closest friends, and she had certainly never spoken of them to Priscilla Vance, who had clearly gathered whatever fragments she could from servants' gossip and stitched them into a story of her own design. "I do not see how the details concern you," Eleanor said, and she was proud in some distant part of her mind that her voice did not shake, though her hands, hidden in the folds of her skirt, had curled into tight fists. Priscilla's smile did not waver. "Oh, they do not concern me at all," she said sweetly. "I only ask because I do so hate to see a mystery go unsolved. And it would put so many minds at ease, you know, to finally understand what a man might have seen or heard that made him change his mind so completely, and so suddenly, on the very morning he meant to marry you." A ripple of soft, uncomfortable laughter moved through the small crowd that had gathered, though Eleanor could see, even through the haze of her own mounting distress, that not everyone found the exchange amusing. Some faces had gone stiff with discomfort. An older woman nearby pressed her lips together and looked away, clearly displeased, though not displeased enough to intervene. Eleanor opened her mouth to answer, though she had no idea what words might come out, no idea how to defend herself against an accusation that was not even a real accusation, only a cruel suggestion dressed up as innocent curiosity. Before she could speak, one of the young women beside Priscilla, a thin, sharp-featured girl named Beatrice Langford, lifted her glass of punch in a gesture that might have looked, to a careless observer, like a simple toast. "Perhaps we ought to drink to whatever it was," Beatrice said, her eyes glittering with the particular delight of someone who has never once had to fear becoming the subject of such a story herself. And as she lifted the glass, whether by true accident or by some small, deliberate carelessness that Eleanor would never be entirely certain of, the dark red liquid tipped forward and splashed across the front of Eleanor's pale blue gown, staining the silk in a wide, spreading mark that could not possibly be hidden or ignored. A gasp rose from the nearest guests, quick and sharp, followed almost immediately by a ripple of laughter, some of it clearly stifled out of genuine embarrassment, but far too much of it open and delighted, the laughter of people who had been waiting all evening for something interesting to happen and had finally gotten their wish. "Oh," Beatrice said, her hand flying to her mouth in a gesture so theatrical that Alina understood, with a sick lurch of certainty, that it had not been an accident at all, or if it had begun as one, Beatrice was more than happy to let it play out as though it had not been. "I am so terribly sorry, Alina. How clumsy of me." Alina stood frozen, the ruined silk clinging cold and wet to her skirt, her face burning with a humiliation so complete that for a moment she could not find a single word to say. She was aware, distantly, of more heads turning toward her, of a low buzz of conversation rising around the edges of the room, of Priscilla's carefully concerned expression that did nothing at all to hide the satisfaction glittering beneath it. "It is quite all right," Alina managed at last, though her voice came out thin and unsteady, and she hated herself in that moment for how badly it shook. "If you will excuse me." She turned to leave, meaning only to escape toward the nearest door, toward the cool night air, toward anywhere at all that was not this ballroom full of watching eyes. But Priscilla's voice followed her, light and carrying, pitched perfectly to reach every ear in the vicinity. "Do not trouble yourself so, Alina," Priscilla called after her, a note of mock kindness threading through the words. "I am sure no one will think any less of you. After all, one can hardly ruin a reputation that has already suffered so much, can one?" The laughter that followed was louder this time, less stifled, and Alina felt it strike her like a physical blow. She stopped walking, though every instinct in her screamed at her to keep moving, to flee the room entirely and never return, because some small, stubborn part of her refused to let Priscilla watch her run. She stood very still, her back to the crowd, her eyes stinging with tears she refused, absolutely refused, to let fall in front of all these watching faces. Her mother appeared at her elbow, having pushed through the crowd with a speed that spoke of pure maternal fury, her own face pale and furious, though even she seemed uncertain, for a long, terrible moment, what to say or do that would not make the situation worse. "Alina, my dear," her mother whispered, taking her arm gently, "come away. We shall go home. This was a mistake, coming here tonight. I ought never to have insisted." Alina nodded, unable to trust her voice, and let her mother begin to steer her toward the edge of the room, past faces that ranged from openly gleeful to quietly ashamed, past whispers that followed them like a current pulling at her heels. She kept her eyes fixed on the door ahead, willing her feet to move steadily, willing herself not to break, not here, not in front of all of them. She did not notice, until it was almost too late, that the crowd ahead of her had begun to part in a different way entirely, not with the careless, curious parting of people eager to watch a scandal unfold, but with the sudden, startled parting of people making way for someone whose approach demanded it. She looked up and found herself staring directly into the eyes of the Duke of Camden, who had stopped walking only a few feet in front of her, his expression unreadable, his gaze moving briefly, unmistakably, to the ruined silk of her gown before returning to her face. The whole room seemed to hold its breath at once. Alina felt her mother's grip tighten on her arm, felt her own heart slam painfully against her ribs, and had exactly enough time to wonder, with a fresh wave of dread, what fresh humiliation the evening might still have in store for her, before the Duke of Camden did something that no one in that ballroom, least of all Alina herself, could possibly have predicted. He held out his hand to her. "Lady Whitcomb," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the sudden hush that had fallen over the entire room, "would you do me the honor of sitting with me a moment? I find I have grown rather tired of standing." The words themselves were perfectly ordinary, perfectly polite, the sort of thing a gentleman might say to any lady at any gathering. But something in the way he said them, something in the steady, deliberate way he held her gaze, made it clear to everyone watching that this was not an ordinary request at all. And Alina, staring up into the calm, unreadable face of a man she had exchanged perhaps a dozen words with in her entire life, felt the whole world narrow down to the sound of her own heartbeat and the warmth of his gloved hand, still extended toward her, patient and unwavering, waiting for her answer. For a long moment, Alina could not move at all. She stood frozen in the center of a ballroom gone utterly silent, her ruined gown clinging cold against her skirts, her mother's hand still gripping her arm. the Duke's outstretched palm waiting patiently before her, as though he had all the time in the world and no notion at all of the storm his simple request had already set loose around them. She did not understand what was happening. Dukes did not cross ballrooms to speak with women whose reputations had been picked clean by gossip years before. Dukes did not offer their hand to a lady standing in a stained gown, moments after being publicly humiliated, in front of half the county's most influential families. And yet here he stood, unmoved by the murmurs already rippling outward through the crowd, his gaze steady on her face as though nothing in the room existed except the two of them. Alina, her mother, whispered, so quietly that only she could hear it, take his hand. She did not know, afterward, exactly what gave her the courage to lift her own gloved hand and place it in his. Perhaps it was simple exhaustion, the particular kind that comes after holding oneself together for too long, when the smallest kindness feels like the only thing strong enough to break the dam. Perhaps it was something in his eyes, some quiet certainty that told her, however impossible it seemed, that he meant her no harm and no mockery, that whatever he intended, it was not one more cruelty added to the pile she had already endured that night. His fingers closed around hers, warm even through the fabric of their gloves, and he drew her forward, away from her mother, away from the ruined stain on her gown that suddenly seemed to matter far less than it had a moment before. The crowd around them had gone so quiet that Alina could hear the individual crackle of the candles burning in their sconces, could hear her own pulse loud in her ears, could hear, somewhere far off, the confused trailing off of the orchestra as the musicians themselves seemed to lose track of their piece, uncertain what to make of the scene unfolding before them. There was a chair not far from where they stood, a heavy, carved seat usually reserved for the most honored guests, positioned near enough to the center of the room that anyone present could see it clearly. The Duke led her toward it, and Alina, still too stunned to fully understand what was happening, allowed herself to be led, her mind racing through a dozen possibilities and settling on none of them. He reached the chair and lowered himself into it with the same unhurried calm he had carried across the entire ballroom. And then, before Alina had even a moment to guess his intention, before she could so much as draw a full breath, he drew her gently but firmly down onto his lap, one arm settling around her waist with a steadiness that left no room for argument, no room for retreat, no room for anything at all except the sheer, staggering shock of what had just occurred in front of the entire assembled company of Camden Hall. The orchestra stopped entirely. For a single, suspended heartbeat, the whole ballroom seemed to freeze in place, every conversation cut off mid-word, every fan stilled halfway through its motion, every eye in the room fixed on the extraordinary sight of the notoriously reserved Duke of Camden, with the county's most talked-about spinster settled upon his knee, as though it were the most natural thing in the world. Alina sat rigid, her cheeks burning hotter than they had ever burned in her life, painfully aware of his arm around her, of the solid warmth of him beneath her, of the sheer, dizzying impossibility of her situation. She wanted to leap up, to flee the room entirely, to disappear through the nearest door and never return to society again. And yet some part of her, some small, astonished part, felt the tremor running through the crowd around them, felt the shift in the air from cruel amusement to genuine, breathless shock, and understood, with a clarity that struck her almost as hard as the moment itself, that whatever else this was, it was not mockery. No one mocked a lady by holding her so carefully, so protectively, in front of an entire room of witnesses. "Your Grace," she managed at last, her voice barely above a whisper, though in the dead silence of the ballroom it seemed to carry to every corner of the room regardless. "What are you doing?" Sitting, he replied simply, his voice calm, almost conversational, as though they were discussing nothing more significant than the weather. "I told you I had grown tired of standing." A ripple of sound moved through the crowd then, some strangled combination of shock and disbelief, and in a few scattered corners, poorly hidden amusement, though Alina could not tell if the amusement was directed at her or at the sheer audacity of what the Duke had just done. She caught sight of Priscilla Vance across the room, her face frozen in an expression of pure, undisguised astonishment, The practiced cruelty wiped clean away and replaced with something far more satisfying to Alina's battered pride, something that looked remarkably like defeat. "I do not understand," Alina said quietly, turning slightly to look at him properly, close enough now to see the fine lines at the corners of his eyes, the steady, unhurried patience in his expression that seemed entirely unaffected by the hundreds of eyes fixed upon them both. "Why would you do this? You have made yourself the subject of every conversation in this room for the rest of the season." "I have made myself the subject of every conversation in this room precisely once tonight," he said, his voice low enough now that it reached only her ears, though his gaze never wavered from her face. "You, Lady Whitcomb, have been made the subject of conversation in this room, and in every room like it, for 3 years running, and I find I have grown considerably more tired of that than of anything else this evening." Alina's breath caught. She stared at him, searching his face for some sign of mockery, some hidden edge to his words that would explain this impossible, reckless gesture as some private joke at her expense, but she found nothing of the kind. His eyes held only a quiet, deliberate steadiness, the look of a man who had made a decision and did not intend to apologize for it, however much scandal it might cause. Behind them, the murmurs continued to swell, rising and falling like a tide, and Alina could hear fragments of it drifting toward her, disbelieving, scandalized, curious. She heard her mother's voice somewhere in the crowd, though she could not make out the words, and she thought she heard, distantly, the sharp, furious whisper of Priscilla Vance demanding to know what on earth the Duke thought he was doing, though no one nearby seemed inclined to answer her. "Your Grace," Alina said again, aware that she ought to rise, that propriety demanded she remove herself immediately from so scandalous a position, and yet finding, to her own considerable surprise, that she did not entirely want to. "The whole room is watching us." "Let them watch," he said, and something in his voice, some quiet, unshakable certainty, made her believe, for the first time in longer than she could remember, that perhaps their watching did not have to mean what it had always meant before. Perhaps, for once, it did not have to mean pity or mockery, or the slow, grinding erosion of her own sense of worth beneath the weight of other people's judgment. "I have watched this room laugh at your expense for 3 years," Nathaniel continued, quietly enough now that his words felt like a private conversation held in the middle of a crowded stage, "and I have said nothing, done nothing, because I told myself it was not my place to interfere. I find tonight that I no longer believe that. I find I would rather be the subject of every scandalized letter written in this county tomorrow morning than stand by and watch it happen again." Alina felt something crack open in her chest, some long-held wall she had built so carefully over 3 years finally beginning to give way. She had grown so accustomed to enduring, to holding herself together in rooms exactly like this one, that she had almost forgotten what it felt like to have someone stand beside her instead of simply watching from the edges. "Why," she whispered, unable to keep the question from slipping free, though she was not entirely certain what she was asking. "Why would you do this for me?" He held her gaze for a long moment, and something flickered across his face then, something that looked almost like uncertainty, an emotion so rare on the Duke of Camden's composed features that Alina found herself holding her breath, waiting. "That," he said quietly, "is a question I intend to answer properly, and privately, if you will allow me the chance. But not here, in front of the whole county's collected curiosity." Behind them, the whispers had grown into something closer to a roar, dozens of low conversations, overlapping into a steady hum of astonishment that filled the ballroom from wall to wall. Somewhere in the crowd, a glass shattered, dropped by some guest too shocked to keep proper hold of it, and the sound seemed to snap the room fully awake, breaking whatever spell had held it frozen in silence. Alina sat very still upon the Duke of Camden's knee, in the middle of Camden Hall's grand ballroom, with the entire county watching, and felt, for the first time in 3 long years, something that was not quite hope and not quite fear but some trembling, uncertain thing caught between the two, and she found, to her own great astonishment, that she was not entirely certain she wanted this moment to end. The Duke rose from the chair, drawing Alina gently up with him, and offered his arm with the same unhurried composure he had shown throughout the entire extraordinary scene, as though escorting a scandal's newest subject through a room full of gawking guests were the most ordinary thing imaginable. Elinor, still reeling, took his arm because she could not think what else to do, and together they walked toward one of the side doors that led out to the long gallery, leaving behind a ballroom so thick with whispered conversation that it seemed almost to hum. Her mother caught up with them just before they reached the door, her face a complicated mixture of alarm and something that might, Elinor thought, have been the first stirrings of hope. "Your Grace," Margaret Whitcomb said, her voice carefully controlled though her eyes darted between her daughter and the Duke with barely restrained astonishment, "I must ask what you intend by this." "I intend only to speak with your daughter privately for a few moments," Nathaniel said, his tone respectful but firm, in the presence of a chaperone, of course, if you will permit it. "I have no wish to add to any difficulty this evening has already caused her." Margaret hesitated, glancing back toward the ballroom where the whispers had not yet begun to fade, then nodded slowly. "I will wait just outside the gallery door," she said, her gaze lingering on Elinor with a silent question that Elinor herself could not yet answer. "Do not be long." They passed through into the long gallery, where the noise of the ballroom faded to a distant murmur, and the tall windows let in the cool silver light of the moon. Portraits of Camden ancestors lined the walls, their painted eyes seeming to follow the pair as they walked, and Elinor became suddenly, acutely aware of how alone she felt despite her mother waiting just beyond the door, how strange and unmoored the whole evening had become in the span of a single quarter-hour. She stopped walking once they had gone far enough that the ballroom's noise no longer reached them clearly, and turned to face him, her hands twisting together in front of her ruined gown. "Your Grace," she said, "before you say anything further I must ask you plainly. Was this some manner of jest? I have endured a great deal of cruelty dressed up as kindness this evening already, and I find I have very little patience left for more of it, however elegantly it might be delivered." Something in his face shifted at that, a flicker of something that looked almost like pain, quickly smoothed away beneath his usual composure. "No," he said, his voice quiet but certain. "It was no jest, Lady Whitcomb. I would not use you so, not for sport, not for any reason at all." "Then why?" she asked again, the same question she had asked in front of the whole ballroom, though this time there was no crowd to overhear the answer. Only the moonlight and the silent portraits, and the two of them standing several feet apart in the long, echoing gallery. He was quiet for a long moment, and Elinor watched him search for words, watched the careful, practiced composure he wore like armor waver just slightly at the edges. "I have watched you endure that same cruelty at gathering after gathering for 3 years, he said finally. "I have watched Priscilla Vance and her circle deliver their little cuts disguised as concern, and I have watched you stand there and absorb every one of them without complaint, because you understood as well as anyone that any defense you offered would only be twisted into further gossip. I have watched it, and I have said nothing, done nothing, and told myself it was not my place." Elinor said nothing, though her chest had grown tight with an emotion she could not quite name. "Tonight," he continued, "I found I could no longer tell myself that. Whatever else the consequences might be, I could not stand at the edge of that room and watch it happen again without doing something to stop it." "But why?" she pressed, her voice cracking slightly on the word. "Why should it matter so much to you? We have exchanged perhaps a dozen words in our entire lives, Your Grace. You owe me nothing." He looked at her then with an intensity that made her breath catch, though he said nothing further on the subject, only shook his head slightly, as though weighing some private decision. "That is a longer conversation," he said at last, "and one I do not think either of us is prepared for tonight, standing here with your gown still damp and your mother waiting just beyond that door. But I promise you, Lady Whitcomb, it is not nothing. It has never been nothing." The words settled over her like a weight she did not yet know how to carry. She studied his face in the moonlight, searching for some sign of deception, some hint that this whole strange evening might yet reveal itself as an elaborate cruelty after all. But she found only steady, quiet sincerity looking back at her, and something in her chest, some old, careful wall built brick by brick over 3 years of disappointment, trembled dangerously close to collapse. "What happens now?" she asked quietly. "When I walk back through those doors, Your Grace, this will not simply be forgotten. Every tongue in the county will be wagging about it by morning. I will be the subject of gossip either way, only now it will be a different sort of gossip entirely, and I am not certain which sort frightens me more." "I understand that better than you might think," he said. "I do not offer you an easy path, Lady Whitcomb. I offer you only my word that whatever gossip follows, I do not intend to abandon you to face it alone, as you have faced everything else these past 3 years. Alina felt tears prick at her eyes then, unexpected and unwelcome, and she blinked them back fiercely, unwilling to cry in front of him, in front of anyone, after already surviving so much humiliation in a single evening. "I do not know what to make of you, Your Grace," she admitted quietly. "An hour ago I did not believe you knew my name." "I have always known your name," he said, so quietly she almost did not catch it, and something in the way he said it made her wonder, with a small, startled jolt, whether there was far more history between them than she had ever suspected, whether this strange, impossible evening had roots reaching back further than she could yet imagine. Before she could ask him what he meant, the gallery door opened and her mother appeared, her expression carefully neutral though her eyes were bright with unspoken questions. "I do not mean to intrude," Margaret said, "but the whole ballroom has begun asking after you both, and I think it best we decide together how to proceed." Nathaniel nodded and turned back to Alina, his expression settling once more into its familiar composure, though something warmer lingered beneath it now, something Alina had never seen there before tonight. "With your permission," he said, "I would like to call upon you properly, Lady Whitcomb, at your family's home, where we might continue this conversation without half the county listening in." Alina glanced at her mother, who gave the smallest, most encouraging nod imaginable, and then back at the Duke, whose steady gaze had not wavered from her face throughout the entire exchange. She thought of the 3 years behind her, of every whispered insult and pitying glance she had endured, of the careful, exhausting work of holding herself together in room after room that seemed determined to remind her of her own worthlessness. She thought of the warmth of his arm around her waist only minutes ago, of the stillness in his voice when he had told her it was not nothing, and she found, to her own considerable surprise, that some small, stubborn hope had begun to flicker back to life inside her chest, a feeling she had believed thoroughly extinguished 3 years before. "Yes," she said finally, her voice steadier than she had expected it to be. "You may call upon me, Your Grace." Something eased in his expression at her answer, a warmth that transformed his usually composed features into something far softer, far more human than the distant, reserved Duke the whole county believed him to be. "Thank you," he said simply, and then, with the same quiet formality that had marked the entire evening, he bowed over her hand and released it, stepping back to allow her mother to draw her gently toward the door that led back to the ballroom, and to the storm of whispered speculation that awaited them there. As they walked back through the long gallery, past the silent, painted eyes of Camden ancestors, Alina's mind raced with 100 unanswered questions, foremost among them the strange, lingering echo of his words. "I have always known your name." She did not yet understand what history lay hidden beneath those simple words, what quiet, patient devotion might have been building itself in silence for years, while she believed herself invisible to everyone but the gossips who delighted in her misfortune. She only knew, walking back toward the ballroom with her mother's hand tight around her arm and her heart still racing from everything that had happened, that whatever came next, her life had shifted irrevocably in the span of a single evening, and she was no longer entirely certain she wished to return to the quiet, careful invisibility she had built for herself over 3 long years. The ballroom noise grew louder as they approached, a rising tide of speculation and astonishment that showed no sign of quieting, and Alina drew a steadying breath, preparing herself to face it, understanding, for the first time in longer than she could remember, that she did not have to face it entirely alone. 3 days passed before the Duke of Camden appeared at the Whitcomb house. though to Alina those 3 days felt like a month, filled as they were with a constant stream of callers eager to hear the story from her own lips, and an equally constant stream of letters from acquaintances she had not heard from in years, all suddenly curious about her health, her happiness, her plans for the season. She answered as few of them as she could manage, and spent most of her time at the window of the small parlor, watching the road, though she told herself firmly, each time she caught herself doing it, that she was not watching for anyone in particular. When his carriage finally arrived on the fourth morning, its fine dark wood and silver crest unmistakable even from a distance, Alina felt her heart leap so suddenly that she had to press a hand to her chest to steady herself. Her mother, who had been sitting nearby with her needlework entirely forgotten in her lap for the better part of an hour, rose at once to arrange the parlor, though it needed no arranging at all, and to send word to the housekeeper that the Duke of Camden would be taking tea. He was shown in a few minutes later, dressed simply in dark green, his manner far less guarded than Alina had ever seen it at any public gathering. He bowed properly to her mother, thanked her for receiving him, and then turned to Alina with an expression that held none of the cool reserve the county so often attributed to him, only a quiet, careful warmth that made her breath catch in her throat. "Lady Whitcomb," he said, "thank you for allowing me to call." Her mother, with the tact of a woman who understood precisely when her presence was required, and when it was not, settled herself in a chair near the far window, close enough to satisfy propriety, far enough to grant them something resembling privacy, and returned to her forgotten needlework with an expression of studied concentration that fooled absolutely no one. Alina gestured Nathaniel toward the chair across from her own, and for a long moment neither of them spoke, the silence stretching between them filled with everything that had passed at the ball and everything that remained unsaid since. It was Nathaniel who broke it first. "I promised you an answer," he said quietly, "to the question you asked me in the gallery. I have thought of little else these past 3 days, trying to decide how best to explain something I have carried alone for a very long time." Alina's hands tightened in her lap. "You said you had always known my name," she said. "I have not been able to stop thinking of it since." He nodded slowly, and when he spoke again, his voice had taken on a careful, measured quality, the voice of a man choosing each word with great deliberation. "Do you remember a garden party," he asked, 11 years ago now, at the Farringtons' estate? You would have been perhaps 17. I had only just returned from my studies, and I said something thoughtless to a young woman there, something that wounded her more than I intended, and you were the one who took me aside afterward and helped me understand why." Alina blinked, searching her memory, and slowly a faint recollection surfaced, hazy with the passage of years. "I remember something of it," she said slowly. "I do not recall the particulars. I did not realize it was you." "I have never forgotten it," he said simply. "It was such a small thing to you, I imagine, a moment's kindness among 100 other moments in a busy season. But I had spent my whole life surrounded by people who either flattered me or feared me, and you were neither. You simply told me the truth, gently, because you believed I deserved the chance to hear it and do better. I do not think I had ever been spoken to quite that way before." Alina felt heat rising in her cheeks, unexpected and strange, at the thought that some careless kindness from her 17-year-old self had lodged itself so deeply in the memory of a man she had barely known existed at the time. "I had no idea," she murmured. "No," he agreed, "you would not have. I said nothing of it then, and very little of it since, though I confess I found myself watching for you at gatherings after that, in the quiet way one watches for someone without quite admitting to oneself why. I watched your engagement to Lord Hale with a great deal more discomfort than I examined too closely at the time. And I was present, though you likely never knew it, at several of the same gatherings where the two of you appeared together in the months before your wedding." Alina's stomach tightened at the mention of Edmund's name, an old, familiar ache stirring despite the years that had passed. "I do not enjoy speaking of that time," she said quietly. "I understand," he said, "and I would not raise it now if I did not believe you deserve to know something you have never known, something I have carried for 3 years, and which I fear has shaped far more of your life than you ever realized." Alina went very still. "What do you mean?" Nathaniel drew a slow breath, his composure visibly costing him something now, some careful control finally beginning to fray at the edges. Edmund Hale and I were not close, he said, but our circles overlapped enough that certain matters reached my ears which likely never reached yours. In the weeks before your wedding, I learned, through channels I will not trouble you with the details of, that Lord Hale had entered into a private arrangement with a woman in London, an arrangement of considerable seriousness, one that had produced a child he had no intention of acknowledging publicly, and no intention of abandoning either, whatever vows he meant to speak in the church that morning. Elinor felt the blood drain from her face. She sat very still, her hands gone cold in her lap, as the old, familiar pain of that morning rose up fresh and raw, tangled now with this new, terrible knowledge she had never possessed. He meant to marry me, she said slowly, while keeping another woman and a child hidden away in London. He meant to marry you, and continue that arrangement in secret, yes, Nathaniel said, his voice heavy with something that sounded almost like guilt. I could not stand by and allow it. I went to him myself, 3 days before the wedding, and told him plainly that I knew the truth, and that I intended to make it known to your family if he did not withdraw from the engagement honorably and quietly, before any vows were spoken that he had no true intention of honoring. Elinor's breath had gone shallow and quick, and he chose to simply vanish instead, she whispered. Rather than face my family or explain himself, he simply fled the county and left me standing in a church full of guests, with no word of explanation at all. I did not intend for it to happen that way, Nathaniel said, and for the first time since she had known him, his composure cracked entirely, revealing something raw and pained beneath it. I gave him the choice to end things honorably, to spare you the public humiliation of a wedding morning collapse. I never imagined he would choose cowardice over honesty, that he would simply run rather than face the consequences of his own actions like a man. I have carried the guilt of that choice for 3 years, Lady Whitcomb. I gave him the opportunity to spare you pain, and instead he caused you far greater pain than either of us intended, and I have watched you carry the weight of it ever since, believing yourself somehow at fault for a betrayal that was entirely his own doing, and knowing that my own interference, however well-intentioned, was the very spark that set it all in motion. Elinor sat in stunned silence, the whole shape of her life over the past 3 years rearranging itself in her mind as she absorbed what he had told her. She had spent 3 years believing herself somehow inadequate, believing that some flaw in her own character had driven Edmund Hale to abandon her without explanation, enduring the whispered speculation of 100 drawing rooms without ever knowing the true, ugly reason behind it. And all that time, the Duke of Camden had known, had carried the knowledge in silence, had watched her suffer under a cloud of gossip built entirely on ignorance of a truth only he possessed. "Why did you never tell me?" she asked at last, her voice barely a whisper. "Why let me believe all this time that I had done something wrong?" "I told myself it was not my place," he said quietly. "I told myself that revealing it would only cause you further pain, dragging up the details of his betrayal for public scrutiny, and that it was kinder to let the matter rest, however unjustly it left your reputation. I told myself a great many things over 3 years to justify my silence. I see now that I was simply afraid of what it would mean to step forward and admit how much I cared about the outcome, afraid of what people would say, afraid of complicating my own carefully guarded life with a truth I had avoided facing directly. I was wrong to let that fear guide me for so long, and I am sorrier for it than I know how to properly express." Elinor felt tears rising hot and sudden, and this time she did not fight them back. 3 years, she said, her voice trembling. 3 years of Priscilla Vance and every other tongue in this county whispering about what I must have done to drive him away. And you knew, the entire time, that it was never anything I had done at all. "I am sorry," Nathaniel said, and the words carried a weight that told her he meant them completely. "Sorry for my silence. Sorry for the pain my interference caused you even as I meant to spare you worse. And sorry that it has taken me 3 years and one reckless, scandalous moment in a crowded ballroom to finally find the courage to tell you the truth of it." Elinor pressed her hands to her face for a long moment, breathing carefully, trying to steady the storm of emotion rising inside her. Anger and grief and something else entirely. Something that felt dangerously close to relief. The relief of finally understanding that the story she had told herself for 3 years, the story the whole county had told about her, had never been true at all. Across the room, her mother had gone entirely still over her forgotten needlework, clearly having overheard enough of the conversation to understand its weight, though she said nothing, granting them both the small mercy of continuing to look elsewhere. "I do not know what to feel," Alina admitted finally, lowering her hands and looking at him properly, her eyes still bright with unshed tears. "I am angry, Your Grace, that you kept this from me for so long, and yet I understand, better than perhaps I should, why fear might keep a person silent about something that matters deeply to them. I have spent 3 years silent about my own pain, for fear of what speaking it aloud might invite." "Then perhaps," Nathaniel said quietly, "we might both try from this day forward to be a little less afraid." Alina looked at him for a long moment, this careful, guarded man who had carried a painful secret alone for 3 years out of fear and misplaced duty, who had finally broken his own long silence in the most public, reckless way imaginable rather than watch her suffer a moment longer, and felt something shift inside her, some old, protective wall finally beginning, cautiously, to open. "I should like that," she said softly, "very much." News of the Duke of Camden's visit to the Whitcomb house spread through the county faster than either Alina or her mother could have anticipated, carried on the same current of gossip that had once delivered nothing but pity and scorn to Alina's door, and now delivered something far more complicated. Invitations that had grown sparse over 3 years began arriving again in a steady stream, and Alina found herself, for the first time since her broken engagement, the subject of curiosity rather than contempt. She did not entirely trust the shift. Priscilla Vance, in particular, had grown notably quiet since the night of the ball, though Alina knew better than to mistake silence for surrender. She learned the truth of it a week later, at a small garden gathering hosted by one of her mother's oldest friends, when Priscilla approached her with a smile so carefully composed that Alina felt her guard rise instantly. "Alina," Priscilla said, her voice pitched with false warmth, "how delightful to see you looking so well. I confess I have been quite curious about the sudden attention you have received. One does wonder what could possibly explain the Duke's interest, after so many years of his famous indifference to every eligible woman in the county." Alina kept her expression carefully neutral, having learned, over the past week, that composure served her far better than any sharp retort. Perhaps he simply grew tired of the county's endless speculation about matters that were never anyone's business but my own, she said evenly. Priscilla's smile thinned, though she recovered quickly. Of course," she said. "Though I do wonder whether his sudden interest has anything to do with certain rumors I have begun to hear, concerning Lord Hale, and a rather scandalous arrangement he is said to have kept hidden in London. It would be quite the story, would it not, if it turned out the Duke had known such a thing all along and said nothing?" Alina's stomach dropped, though she forced herself to keep her face still. She had told no one outside her own family what Nathaniel had confided in her, understanding instinctively how dangerous that knowledge could become in the wrong hands, how easily it could be twisted into a fresh scandal that painted the Duke as a man who had allowed her humiliation to continue for his own private reasons, however good his intentions had truly been. She did not know how Priscilla had caught even a whisper of the truth, though she suspected, with a sinking heart, that servants' gossip traveled faster and further than any family could fully contain. "I have no notion what you mean," Alina said carefully, "and I would advise against repeating idle rumors you cannot substantiate, Priscilla. Such things have a way of causing far more harm than their tellers intend." Priscilla's eyes glittered with something that looked uncomfortably close to triumph. "Oh, I intend no harm at all," she said sweetly. "I simply thought you would wish to know that such talk has begun circulating, before it reaches ears less friendly than mine." She drifted away before Alina could formulate a response, leaving her standing alone amid the garden's carefully tended roses with her heart pounding, and her mind racing through the implications of what she had just heard. If the truth of Edmund's betrayal and Nathaniel's role in confronting him became public knowledge, twisted through the machinery of gossip into something uglier than the truth deserved, it could unravel everything, could paint Nathaniel as complicit in her suffering rather than the man who had finally, however belatedly, tried to make it right. She sought him out that same evening, sending word ahead so that he might meet her in her family's small parlor, and told him everything Priscilla had said, watching his face carefully as she spoke, searching for some sign of the fear she herself felt building beneath her composure. He listened without interrupting, his expression growing steadily more troubled as she finished, and when she had done, he was quiet for a long moment, turning something over in his mind. "I suspected this might come, eventually," he said finally. "Secrets rarely stay buried forever, especially not in a county as small and as hungry for scandal as this one. I had hoped for more time to decide how best to address it, but it seems that time has run out rather sooner than I expected." "What will you do?" Alina asked, twisting her hands together in her lap. "I think," he said slowly, "the only path that does not leave us at the mercy of whatever version of the story Priscilla Vance chooses to spread, is to tell the truth ourselves, plainly and without hiding from it, before she or anyone else has the chance to distort it into something crueler than the facts themselves." Alina felt a flicker of alarm. "You mean to make it public? That Edmund kept a woman and a child hidden in London. That will only bring further scandal down upon my family's name on top of everything else." "It will bring the truth into the light," he said gently, "and the truth, however uncomfortable, paints you as the wronged party you have always been, and Edmund Hale as the dishonorable man he chose to be. I would rather face that truth openly, standing beside you, than watch it be twisted into something that harms you further while I stand silent, as I already did once before, to my great and lasting regret." Alina studied him for a long moment, weighing the fear of further scandal against the quiet certainty in his voice, and found, somewhat to her own surprise, that she trusted his judgment more than she trusted her own instinct to hide from the story entirely, as she had hidden from so much for 3 long years. "And what of your own reputation?" she asked quietly. "Will people not question why you kept silent so long? Will this not cost you as much as it costs me?" "Perhaps," he admitted, "but I find I would rather bear that cost honestly than continue building whatever future I hope to have with you on a foundation of buried secrets and careful silences. I have had enough of silence, Lady Whitcomb. I do not intend to return to it now." Something in his steady certainty settled the worst of her fear, though a smaller, quieter worry remained, one she found harder to voice aloud. "And my family," she said finally. "My mother has already suffered so much on my behalf these past 3 years. I do not know that I have the right to ask her to endure yet another wave of gossip, however different its nature." "You need not ask her alone," Nathaniel said. "I intend to speak with your mother myself, and with your father if he will receive me and lay the whole matter before them honestly, so that whatever choice is made, it is made together and not carried by you in solitude, as you have carried so much else." Alina felt tears prick at her eyes again, though these carried none of the sharp grief of the tears she had shed in the parlor a week before, only something warmer, something that felt dangerously like gratitude, like the first tentative stirrings of trust in a man who had proven, again and again, that he meant to stand beside her rather than watch from a comfortable distance. Her father, a quiet, thoughtful man who had said little through the whole ordeal of the past 3 years beyond offering what comfort he could, received Nathaniel's confession 2 days later with a gravity that surprised even Alina. He listened to the full account, his expression darkening at the details of Edmund Hale's betrayal, and when Nathaniel had finished, he was silent for a long moment before speaking. "You ought to have told us sooner," Mr. Whitcomb said finally, though there was less anger in his voice than Alina had feared, more a weary, worn-down disappointment. "But I understand something of the impossible position you found yourself in, Your Grace, and I confess I would rather learn the truth now, however uncomfortable, than continue believing the lie the county has told about my daughter for 3 years. The decision was made in the end to release the truth through careful, measured channels, a quiet word here and a considered letter there, allowing the facts to spread through the county's gossip networks on their own terms rather than waiting for Priscilla Vance to seize control of the narrative first. It was, Alina understood, a considerable risk, one that might yet cost both her and Nathaniel a great deal of social standing, however honest the truth might be. But standing beside him as the plan unfolded, watching him face the prospect of scandal without flinching, without once suggesting they retreat into safer silence, Alina found herself steadier than she had felt in 3 long years, no longer facing the world's judgment alone, but bracing against it together, with a partner who had chosen, deliberately and at real cost to himself, to stand at her side. The truth spread through the county exactly as Nathaniel had predicted, though not without its share of turbulence along the way. Within a fortnight, there was scarcely a drawing room in the district that had not heard some version of the story, and to Alina's cautious relief, the version that took hold was, for the most part, the true one. Edmund Hale, it was now widely understood, had abandoned his bride not because of any fault of hers, but because he had been concealing a secret arrangement of his own making, one that spoke far more poorly of his character than anything Alina had ever been accused of. The shift in public opinion did not happen all at once, nor did it happen without resistance. Some of the older, more rigid families in the county clung to their old suspicions out of pure stubbornness, unwilling to admit they had spent 3 years judging an innocent woman unfairly. But far more people, Alina found, were simply relieved to finally understand the true shape of a story they had turned over so many times in idle conversation. And more than a few came to her directly, in the weeks that followed, to offer quiet, awkward apologies for the years of whispered judgment they had, in their own small ways, contributed to. Priscilla Vance did not apologize. She could not, Alina suspected, quite bring herself to admit how thoroughly her own careful cruelty had been built on nothing at all. But her influence over the county's gossip networks weakened considerably in the weeks that followed, as more and more people grew tired of her sharp tongue now that it no longer had Alina's supposed disgrace to feed upon. Alina found, to her own quiet satisfaction, that she felt very little triumph in Priscilla's diminished standing. She felt only a kind of tired relief, the relief of a burden finally set down after being carried far too long. Through all of it, Nathaniel remained steadily at her side, calling upon her nearly every week, walking with her through the gardens of her family's estate, sitting with her in quiet conversation that ranged from the trivial to the deeply personal. And Alina found herself, slowly and almost without noticing it happening, falling in love with a man she had once believed entirely unreachable. He was not, she came to learn, the cold, distant figure the county had always taken him for. He was thoughtful, careful with his words, because he had learned early in life how much damage careless words could cause. And beneath his composed exterior, he carried a dry, quiet humor that surprised her the first time it emerged, drawing a genuine, startled laugh from her during what she had expected to be an entirely serious conversation about estate management. He listened when she spoke, really listened, in a way that few people in her life ever had, and he never once made her feel as though her years of humiliation had left any permanent mark upon her worth. His aunt, the Dowager Duchess Constance, called upon Alina personally one afternoon in early autumn, arriving with her usual cane tapping sharply against the floor and her sharp eyes missing nothing as she settled herself into the Whitcomb parlor's best chair. "I have heard a great deal about you, young woman," she said without preamble, once tea had been poured and the servants dismissed. "Some of it kind, some of it considerably less so, though I have my own opinions about the reliability of county gossip, having been its subject myself on more than one occasion in my youth." Alina, unsure quite how to respond to such bluntness, simply waited. "My nephew has not looked at another woman the way he looks at you in all the years I have known him," the Duchess continued, studying Alina with an intensity that made her want to fidget, though she held herself still through sheer force of will. "I confess, I was beginning to despair of ever seeing him settle at all. I do not offer my approval lightly, Lady Whitcomb, but I find I have very little reason to withhold it in your case. You have weathered a great deal these past years, and weathered it, from everything I have observed, with considerably more grace than most young women twice your experience. Elinor felt a warm flush of gratitude at the unexpected kindness, though she could not quite find words equal to it, and the Duchess, seeming to sense as much, waved a dismissive hand and moved the conversation on to lighter matters, leaving Elinor with the distinct impression that she had just passed some manner of test she had not fully understood she was taking. It was several weeks later, on a crisp afternoon in early October, that Nathaniel called upon her with a request that she walk with him through the gardens at Camden Hall, the same gardens. He reminded her with a small, private smile that bordered the very ballroom where their strange, scandalous courtship had first begun. Elinor agreed readily, and they walked together beneath trees just beginning to turn gold at the edges, the last warmth of the season settling comfortably around them. He was quieter than usual as they walked, and Elinor, who had grown attuned to his moods over the past months, sensed something building beneath his careful composure, some nervousness he was working hard to conceal. They stopped, eventually, beside a small stone bench overlooking a pond where swans drifted lazily across the still water, and Nathaniel turned to face her fully, his expression more open and unguarded than she had ever seen it, even in their most private conversations. "Elinor," he said, and something in the way he said her given name, without title, without formality, made her heart begin to race. "I have spent a great many years guarding myself very carefully, telling myself that duty and caution ought to govern every decision I made, particularly decisions concerning marriage. I watched my own parents build a marriage on careful calculation rather than genuine affection, and I told myself I would rather remain unmarried entirely than repeat their mistake." Elinor waited, her breath held, watching the careful uncertainty flicker across his usually composed face. "I do not feel that caution any longer," he continued. "Not with you. I have known you, in one fashion or another, for 11 years now, though it took me far too long, and far too much painful history, to finally act upon what I have felt for you for a great deal of that time. I do not wish to spend a single additional year standing at the edge of a room, watching you from a careful distance, telling myself it is not my place to close it." He reached into his coat and drew out a small velvet box, and Elinor's hand flew to her mouth as he lowered himself onto one knee before her. There, beside the still, glassy pond with the swans drifting past, and the golden autumn light falling softly around them both. "Lady Elinor Whitcomb," he said, his voice steady now, all trace of nervousness settled into quiet, unwavering certainty, "will you do me the very great honor of becoming my wife? Not because duty requires an heir, and not because the county expects it, but because I cannot imagine building the rest of my life with anyone other than you standing beside me." Elinor felt tears spill freely down her cheeks, tears of a kind entirely different from any she had shed in the 3 difficult years before this one, and she found she could barely speak past the fullness in her throat, though the word, when it finally came, emerged clear and certain. "Yes," she said, and then, laughing through her tears as he rose and drew her into his arms, "yes, 1,000 times yes." He kissed her then, gently, beneath the golden trees, with only the swans and the quiet autumn afternoon as witness, and Elinor felt, for the first time in longer than she could properly remember, that the story of her life was no longer one that other people got to write for her through whispered gossip and cruel speculation. It was hers now, hers and Nathaniel's together, and whatever chapters remained ahead of them, she intended to write them with her chin held high and her heart, at long last, entirely unafraid. Their wedding took place the following spring, in the same small stone church where Elinor's first engagement had ended in such public heartbreak, though this time the church filled with genuine joy rather than confused whispers, and Elinor walked down the aisle toward a man who had spent months proving, in ways both grand and quiet, that he meant to stand beside her for the whole of her life rather than abandon her to face it alone. Priscilla Vance attended, seated near the back, her expression carefully composed though Elinor caught, just once, a flicker of something that might almost have been genuine happiness for her, buried beneath years of practiced rivalry. As Alina spoke her vows, her voice steady and clear in the same church where she had once stood frozen in her wedding gown waiting for a groom who would never arrive, she felt the last of the old grief finally settle into something quieter, something at peace. She was no longer the spinster the county had once whispered about with pity and scorn. She was Alina Ashford now, Duchess of Camden, standing beside a man who had crossed an entire crowded ballroom, defying every rule of propriety the county held dear, simply because he could no longer bear to watch her suffer alone. The whole hall had fallen silent that night, all those months before, stunned by the sight of a duke pulling a rejected woman onto his lap in front of the whole assembled county. But Alina understood now, standing in her wedding gown with her hand clasped in Nathaniel's, that the silence had never been about scandal at all. It had been the sound of an entire room witnessing, for the first time, what it truly looked like when someone chose, without hesitation and without regard for consequence, to stand up for the person they loved. A year passed, and then another, and the halls of Camden Estate that had once felt so grand and formal to Alina slowly transformed into something she was proud to call home. She learned the rhythms of the household, the names of every servant and tenant family on the estate, and she brought to her new position the same quiet warmth that had once drawn a 19-year-old Nathaniel to seek her counsel at a garden party neither of them had ever forgotten. The tenants, who had grown used to a distant, business-like relationship with the previous Duchess, found themselves surprised and pleased by Alina's habit of visiting personally, of remembering the names of children and the details of small hardships, of insisting that the estate's resources be used generously rather than merely adequately. Nathaniel, for his part, found that marriage had softened none of his sense of duty but had transformed the shape of it entirely. Where once he had approached his responsibilities as a duke with careful, dutiful distance, he now found himself eager to share the burdens and decisions of the estate with Alina, whose instincts for kindness so often illuminated solutions he had never considered on his own. His aunt, the Dowager Duchess, declared on more than one occasion that she had never seen her nephew laugh so freely nor argue so passionately about matters he cared for, and she took no small satisfaction in reminding anyone who would listen that she had approved of the match from the very beginning. Priscilla Vance, in the years that followed, married a gentleman of modest fortune from a neighboring county, and though she and Alina never became close, the sharp edges of their old rivalry gradually wore smooth with time and distance. Alina found, somewhat to her own surprise, that she bore the other woman no lasting resentment. She had learned, through everything the past years had taught her, that cruelty so often grew from a person's own private unhappiness, and she found she preferred to spend her energy building the life she wanted rather than nursing old grievances against those who had once tried to diminish her. The birth of their first child, a daughter with her father's steady gray eyes and her mother's quick, ready smile, brought a joy to Camden Hall that the old portraits lining its gallery walls had perhaps never witnessed in quite the same measure. Alina held her newborn daughter in the same long gallery, where she and Nathaniel had first spoken honestly with one another, beneath the painted gaze of ancestors who had watched over centuries of the family's triumphs and sorrows, and she felt, in that quiet moment, the full weight of how far her life had traveled from the frightened, humiliated woman who had once stood frozen in a stained gown at the edge of a crowded ballroom. She often thought back, in quiet moments, to that single, extraordinary night, to the shock rippling through the ballroom as Nathaniel crossed the floor toward her, to the impossible, scandalous moment when he had drawn her onto his lap in front of the entire assembled county, and silenced every whispering tongue in the room with nothing more than his own quiet, unshakable resolve. She understood now, with the clarity that only time and happiness could bring, that the moment had never truly been about scandal at all, however the county had gossiped about it in the weeks that followed. It had been the moment a careful, guarded man had finally chosen courage over caution, had finally decided that protecting someone he loved mattered more than protecting his own careful reputation. She thought, too, of her own transformation across those months, of how she had learned, slowly and sometimes painfully, to stop apologizing for a betrayal that had never been her fault, to stop shrinking herself smaller in rooms that had once seemed determined to remind her of her own unworthiness. She had learned that resilience did not always look like standing alone and enduring. Sometimes, she had discovered, the greater courage lay in allowing someone else to stand beside her, in trusting that she did not have to carry every burden by herself simply because she had once been taught by painful experience that no one else could be relied upon to help carry it. On quiet evenings, when the household had settled and their daughter slept soundly in her nursery, Alina and Nathaniel would often sit together in the small study that had become their favorite room in all of Camden Hall, the fire crackling low in the grate, and speak of everything and nothing. The easy, comfortable conversation of two people who had built, deliberately and with great care, a partnership founded on honesty rather than convenient silence. Nathaniel had kept his promise, made in the gallery on the night of that first extraordinary ball, never again to let fear or careful caution keep him from speaking plainly about the things that mattered most. And Alina found, with each passing year, that the trust between them only deepened, strengthened by the difficult honesty of their beginning rather than weakened by it. She sometimes received letters from young women in the county, distant acquaintances, or even strangers entirely, who had heard some version of her story, and wrote to ask how she had found the strength to endure 3 years of public judgment before her life finally changed. Alina answered each letter personally, though she was always careful in her replies to explain that endurance alone had never been the answer. What had truly changed her life, she wrote, was not simply surviving the county's cruelty, but finally allowing herself to believe that she deserved better than quiet suffering, and finding, at last, someone willing to stand beside her and prove that belief correct. The old ballroom at Camden Hall, the very room where their story had so dramatically begun, remained a favorite gathering place for the family in the years that followed, hosting not only the grand seasonal balls that Nathaniel's position required, but smaller, warmer gatherings as well, birthdays and quiet family celebrations that filled the space with a different kind of memory than the cold, curious whispers that had once filled it on the night everything changed. Alina would sometimes stand near the same tall window where she had once hidden among the white roses, watching her own children grow older within those walls, and feel a quiet, settled gratitude for the winding, difficult path that had led her, eventually, to exactly the life she had once believed lost to her forever. Years later, when their daughter had grown old enough to ask about the portrait of her parents that hung near the entrance of the ballroom, painted in the early years of their marriage, Alina would tell her, in simple terms fit for a child's understanding, the story of a difficult morning long ago, and of a night much later, when a brave man had crossed a crowded room to make certain she never had to face difficulty alone again. She never dwelled on the cruelty of those 3 hard years in the telling, choosing instead to focus on what came after, on the courage it had taken both of them, in their own separate ways, to finally choose honesty over careful silence and love over fear. And so the story that had once traveled through the county as nothing more than scandalous gossip, the tale of a duke who had shocked an entire ballroom by pulling a rejected spinster onto his lap in full view of everyone, became instead, over the years, a different kind of story entirely within the walls of Camden Hall itself. It became a story of second chances, of quiet courage finally spoken aloud, and of a love that had waited patiently, through years of misunderstanding and careful silence, for exactly the right moment to make itself known, undeterred by whispers, unshaken by scandal, and entirely, completely unwilling to be silenced ever again.